Part of the problem has been that mostly in our region, we see, in some countries, we see poor quality goods coming in from other countries. They're cheaper and they're of low quality. So which kind of makes it hard for our manufacturers to compete. So what we need in the region are standardized, harmonized standards and quality control that would allow us to, one, have a fair competition with the rest of the world.
Yes, and speaking about the region, we usually hear there is friction between some countries, you know, when it comes to trade. So what are the causes for this trade friction between some countries in the East African community, and also who is losing out more when this happens?
The thing we need to appreciate about trade is we are always going to have trade frictions. It's not exclusively an East African affair. It happens everywhere in the world. You heard about the China-American trade spat, so trade frictions occur. Within the East African context, what is happening is there has been a rise in the non-tariff barriers within the region. From 2016, if you look at the data, you can see that there has been a significant rise in non-tariff barriers within the region. Now, who are the losers? Obviously, it's the consumers in the region. One, it's the consumers, and it's the manufacturers in the region, because you end up with tit-for-tat non-tariff barriers in the region, and this is a problem. But fortunately, the East African community has recognized this, and they're taking steps to try and solve this problem. Last week in Arusha, we attended a meeting where actually the issue was dealing with these non-tariff barriers in the region. Yeah.
And still in the region, we see that local manufacturing, they're not performing at their full potential. You know, they're only at 70% level. So what could be done to harness this? Yet we still have demands on the region.
That is true. The manufacturers in the region are not meeting their potential. We looked at the numbers, and we noticed that there is still room for growth from our manufacturing sector. So what can be done? We have to think of what are the constraints that these manufacturers are facing. One of the biggest constraints has been the lack of a regional industrial policy. Secondly, even with the national industrial policies, most of them are in relative infancy. They are new policies. So if you compare our industrial policies to countries like Ethiopia, for example, they've had an industrial policy for over 10 years, and you can see the fruits of their industrial policy. Our industrial policies in East Africa are relatively new, and so yeah, so that is where we could make a change. Strong industrial policies, both at the regional and at the national levels, and we have to finance our industrial policies.
Yeah, and could you also say that's the reason? Because in 2006, the growth rate in the manufacturing sector was at a peak, you know, at 8.2%. But in 2016, the growth shrunk to about 4.7%. So what is the difference? What was happening before 2006, and what is not happening now? What is not being done now, and how can we change this?
Well, 2006 was actually before the global economy crashed in 2008. So part of the reason why manufacturing exports were affected was because in 2008 we had that big global crash. But even then, what has been missing is, like I said, we don't have a strong industrial policy in the region. Now, we're lucky in the sense that we've had a strong regional integration policy. So regional integration has actually driven manufacturing in the region. If you look at the numbers, regional integration has driven manufacturing. But regional integration on its own is not enough. You need a complementary policy. That's why you need a strong industrial policy to work with the regional integration policy to push the manufacturing sector.
Yeah, and we've seen that recently the East African community has developed an industrial policy to promote the manufacturing sector, and it's expected to account for 25% from the 10% by 2032. So how is this going to work, and what is entailed in this policy?
I think what the East African community has in mind is a regional policy, coordination between the national policies, the national industry policies, because as we alluded to in the discussion yesterday, domestic, when we say domestic in the context of Eastern Africa, domestic should be East African as opposed to domestic is just Uganda or domestic is just Tanzania. When we say these are domestic industries, we should think within the region. So the East African industrial policy will take into account the different national policies and try and harmonize these policies so that we have one regional policy. And then I think the other thing that has been missing is the finance for industrial policy. So that is important that the national governments realize it's not enough to have a policy, you need to be able to finance it.
And is this conversation happening in regards to financing?
Yes, this conversation is happening. We attended a meeting, like I said, we attended a meeting last week in Arusha at the East African community. And this was one of the conversations they were having. How are we going to finance industrial policy in the region? Because it's not enough to have a good policy. You need to finance it.
Yes, and was there a day when should we expect this to happen, or is it still out there?
I think they're still deliberating on this, but the fact that they've recognized that we need a strong industrial policy in the region and we need to finance it is an important step, because I think before 2008, industrial policy in the region was not something that was a priority. But right now we're realizing that, okay, regional integration is not enough. We need industrial policy. So if we are going to compete on a global market, global scale, we need to be able to have these complementary policies that work hand in hand.